Appalachia, a word that evokes a whole passel of reactions. Everything from mountaintop beauty to trailer park drugs and about everything in between. Now, the Appalachian Mountains are indeed the oldest mountains in the world. They once towered 30,000 feet into the air. They stretched from eastern Canada through 14 states all the way to Louisiana. The folks that live in these mountains have faced an unending number of tragedies and just plain odd happenings and cry out for the telling. Hello, I'm Larry Benton, and I was born and raised in these very mountains by folks who themselves were born, raised, and lived for generations in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Come with me and we'll take a look at some of the unending stories that come from within my beloved mountains, and we'll look through the eyes of an Appalachian at some outside the area as well. Welcome to Season 5 of Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend. Howdy, my good friends. I hope you're doing well today. Thank you for stopping by. Now, at the top of every episode, you hear me refer to drugs as being a part of the thoughts that come to mind when people say the word Appalachian. Well, I'm here to tell you that it don't come without a reason. Meth heads hold a place in the mountains that's very unique. The original outlaw of the mountains was usually tied to the cooking and bootlegging of that good old Mountain Dew. Now, when Prohibition came in, and it was recalled, it put a little bit of a dent in the moonshine empires across the Appalachians. Now, when came the younger generations and the Vietnam War, the new moonshiners added marijuana to supplement the moonshine business. Then the later generation figured out that they could mix a few household chemicals with some kind of cold medicine, and voila, you got yourself another cash stream. And that's very highly addictive, which guarantees long-term stream of income. So, that is, as long as you don't dip into it, snort off all the profits, and get caught doing it. Or maybe, one leads to the other, usually. Now, if you ain't ever had the indignity of witnessing somebody on the crank, then you're just ain't no way in God's heaven on earth that I could adequately describe it to you so you can get the real picture. But today I'm going to try. So grab you, sit down, hold on tight while I give you a whirlwind rundown of a meth-fueled weekend from hell for some individuals from South Carolina. Folks, if you're watching on YouTube, Rumble, or maybe Spotify, you're looking at what was a big haul for somebody who done a bust on a meth supply. That right there is what they call meth. Now, at least that's what I've always heard it called. It's called crystal, crank, and several other things. But folks, this is going to get pretty interesting and downright complicated because a meth head don't have a rhyme or reason for what it does. So I'm just giving you that bit of information up front. We'll be heading to Townville, South Carolina for this wackadoodle monstrosity. It involves a man named Troy Allen Burkhart. Now, that's old Troy right there you're looking at if you happen to be watching the video. Now, he was born June 5th, 1967, to his parents Warren and Diane Burkhart. Warren was a former Miami-Dade police officer who was then a restaurant owner and a contractor by that time. So he was a pretty busy man. Troy and his sister Lori were brought up in a pretty decent childhood. At least that's so said every piece of information that I could find on it. By 1984, at the age of 17, Troy was a teen fashion model for the Greenville News. It was probably a good little gig for him. He was modeling fashion for the Greenville News back when, the newspapers were big enough to afford that kind of thing. By the way, if you ain't never been to Greenville, plan you a good run down there and check it out because it's a beautiful place and there's a whole bunch of good folks down there. Now, he played that modeling gig all through high school. After he had a little bit of time, after high school, he had a little bit of time trying to find out what to do and maybe who to do it with. Now, you might say that he had a few legal scrapes with the law, just to maybe give him the benefit of a doubt at that time. But in 1992, he was arrested for grand larceny of a motor vehicle. About that same time, old Troy started dating a friend of his sister named Michelle. Troy and Michelle, well, they took to each other pretty hot and heavy. When court came up for his car theft, Troy did get a little probation, which, if it was me, I would have considered, to be dodging a bullet and maybe straightened up a little bit. Meanwhile, Troy and Michelle got engaged and were married in 1993. Of course, marriage, sometimes calms folks down. Matter of fact, a lot of time it calms folks down. But then again, on some folks, it just don't take. Well, Troy was the one it didn't take on. He continued right on, clogging back and forth over the lines of legality, and in 1995 he was arrested for disposing of property under lien. And what that means is that the property he was got a hold of, maybe it was a car or something, it wasn't worth the payments he was making on it, so he torched it, or maybe wrapped it around a tree on purpose. Most likely it was a vehicle, but could have been a house, a boat, or what have you. But there's nothing I could find on what exactly it was, what the property was that he had a loan against, but he destroyed it while it was under loan. Apparently, he didn't take kindly to being accused of a crime because it got even worse when the police come to arrest him for it. He was, I guess, determined that he wasn't fixing to have any of that. Figured it was better to get in a knockdown, drag-out fight with the police than to just go with them and get it over with. Of course, as with all who take that route, he was charged with resisting arrest once he lost the fight and was hog-tied and dragged off to jail for his trouble. And after all that blew over, in 1997, he and his wife Michelle owned and ran a bar that was located near the Clemson area. Now, from what I read about it, it was a pretty nice little out-of-the-way place. It was called Traditions, and they even did a little catering and private parties. And so that must mean that Troy straightened up and was doing all right by then, right? Well, not exactly. Now, in November of 1997, Traditions was booked for a frat party from the students at Clemson University to happen later that month. Now, the fraternity booked the bar for the entire weekend, and that's how you make your little extra income. You can rent the bar out for a private event and then still sell your beverages over the bar. Now, this was a particularly good deal because, frat houses know how to put away a little bit of booze. So Troy and Michelle were probably going to wind up with a little extra folding money come Christmas time. Everybody was good to go until came Thursday evening, November 13th, when they were getting, everything ready and all readied up when they found a problem with the septic system. Now, the bar was on the septic system, because it's way out in the sticks, and no town or county had ran a sewer line or water to hook up on, so it likely was probably on a well, too. Sometimes, they'll run water out, but most of the time they'll do that before they have a sewer. But anyway, it didn't have a sewer hookup, so apparently things were backing up and literally causing a stink in the place. That night, Troy decided to go over to his friend Paul Zastro's house because he hung out pretty regularly with Paul. Now, I'd say by this time, Michelle was probably ready to wring his neck out like a dish rag because somebody needed to get the septic system fixed and stop walking around without a care in the world. Now, while he was over at Paul's house, talking about the knee-deep turd soup back at the bar, he met two of Paul's friends. They were two brothers named Shane and Stacy Walters. Shane was 27 years old. Stacy, he was 21. The two brothers, well, they installed mobile homes for a living. So while Troy was bitching about the septic tank, Paul told him that Shane and Stacy have a little bit of experience installing septic systems, and they just might be able to help you out with the problem. Now, the Walters boys, well, they agreed to have a look at it and see, if they could help. After all, there ain't much to a septic system. Sewage goes into the septic tank, gets broken down, and leaches out into the ground through the distribution box and leaching pipes that go out into the ground that are buried. So they told Troy that Friday night they had to come by the bar and try to get the septic system straightened out. So they met Troy, that Friday night over at Traditions, and they got to work, digging holes all over the place, just trying to figure out what was going on. Now, before you know it, they had a bonfire built in the middle of it all. Now, we'll say that November's right chilly, and they'd have probably had a good idea to maybe help keep them warm, but the problem is that the bonfire comes with drinks, so they figured that they'd have a few beers as they work. Nothing wrong so far, except that there could be a little more working and less socializing going on. But by the time the lawn chairs came out, and they were all pretty much just sitting around a big bonfire drinking beer, and yeah, folks, leave it to young men, it deteriorates pretty quick. They should have, had Michelle there ramrodding the operation, and things might have went where they went. or where they're fixing to go by this time. Now, by the time they had pretty much forgot why they were all there and decided it was time to blow it on out, and somebody, according to what I found, it was one of the Walter boys, broke out to meth. Now, it ain't like they ain't already taken leave of their senses by the point of having the sewer gases flowing all around them and an open flame out, but they're snorting lines of the devil's dandruff on top of it. Now, before you know it, somebody put a call out and that there was a septic tank party and a big bonfire and meth over at Tradition's Bar. And every meth head within about a 100-mile radius shows up in droves. So people are dodging the septic holes while standing around a big bonfire, even smoking weed too, snorting meth, and drinking up the bar's beer until the sun come up. Now, it was like somebody put a bunch of bad ideas into a hat and drew one out. Now, the conversation between Troy and the Walters boys turned deer hunting, which, with the time Troy explained that he'd never been and showed them his Colt 45 1911 that he carried around for protection because he carried the bar's cash to the bank or maybe whatever mattress he stuffed it in on a daily basis. Now, the boys told him that not to worry about a thing. They were going to take care of him deer hunting and show him how it worked. In fact, they told him to come on and we'll go right now. We're going to take that handgun of yours and drop one. So they piled in the truck and went out looking for deer. Now, you can imagine a gaggle of meth heads racing through the woods in a truck trying to find an animal with a keen sense of smell and a hearing that's about 1,000 times that of a human being. Now, despite all that, they did see one, but it was already in the wind, so they didn't take the shot. After about an hour or so, their methed up hunting expedition, they pissed on the fire and called in the dogs. In other words, they must have ran out of the crystal marching powder, got tired, crawled all over them like maple syrup, and the bodies finally probably got crying for sleep there toward the end. Now, they went ahead and drove Troy home to Michelle, who was probably excited to learn that the long night's work fixed the septic system. That was until she found out it didn't. There was going to have to be a second day's work involved, and the Walters boys were coming back to finish up that afternoon. So I reckon she thought that the problem was a little more worse than they anticipated, but she was thankful that the folks like the Walters boys were helping out. Poor woman likely had no idea what probably really happened. Now, by the time everybody slept off the previous night's rampage, afternoon turned into, well, it was 9 o'clock at night. That time, Troy, Shane, Stacy, they all got together and worked on the septic system again. To make a long story short, it may as well have been a replay of the night before because the same thing happened all over again. Beer, weed, meth, same people from the party the night before all reared their heads for round two. So there they all were, all over again, getting down with the bad selves while helping themselves to the beer from the bar, which was actually open for business at the times. Michelle must have been inside running herself ragged, serving folks and thinking the septic system was almost there while her idiot husband was out back working on, well, all the illicit substances that he could absorb in his body without dying. Now, all the bar patrons in the front paying their tab while the rager was going on in the back with the entire septic system half dug up, a bonfire half the size of Chicago, free beer that Troy kept bringing out to him, while the others supplied the weed and meth. Yeah, that about covers the picture we're looking at here. Along about 2 o'clock in the morning, the bar closed and the party for most of them just broke up. That happened right as a deer hunting conversation was fired back up between Troy and the Walters boys. Troy and Shane, who's the older Walter brother, decided that they were going to go deer hunting the next morning. I reckon they were so blitzed on the crank and everything else that they didn't realize that it was the next morning already, and it was about the time hunters rise and shine to get their stuff together to start hunting. At least that's how it worked where I'm from. So Troy, apparently being the one that could still drive between all of them, dropped Shane off at his place and then went home to get ready for Sunday morning hunting trip. Troy, now being all readied up for the Mutual of Omaha Wild Kingdom run, sat there waiting for Shane. Shane never showed up. Make a note here, folks, meth heads are a little flaky and probably pretty much undependable in that situation. Troy, well, he got tired of waiting, so he went over to Shane's house and knocked on the door. Not getting an answer, he left. Then apparently he forgot that he actually went there the first time because he turned around, went back, and knocked on the door again. After that, he figured that the night before must have been a little bit rough for Shane, and he must be in a coma or something. So Troy, probably still humming from the meth, headed over to Paul Zastro's house. You remember him? He was the one that introduced all of them together. Troy hit the coffee with Paul. Now, I guess you're probably thinking the same thing I was thinking when I was going over this story of what blame near always happens in our stories. No, Shane, he was still alive. He was just doing exactly what Troy thought. He was sleeping off the night before. From what I've seen, when you crash off the meth, you hover pretty close to death from outright exhaustion. Now, even when that happens, the randomness of the meth head still rules the day. So we used to call it burning the candle at both ends, around the middle, up both sides, and down the back. Now, once Shane snapped out of his coma, probably hit his first sniff of the dancing dust, that's when he and his wife Vicky decided that they were going to have a NASCAR party right there in the little trailer. Troy couldn't get a hold of Shane all that morning, so he grabbed up Paul's Astro and they headed over to Shane and Vicky's. Now, Shane's brother Stacy, well, he was a younger feller, and worked with Stacy, so he lived there in the trailer with them. Now, Troy and Paul, they roll up while the NASCAR party is winding down around 4 o'clock that evening. Finally, Troy gets to talking to Shane, and he apologizes for forgetting about the deer hunting safari. Now, he said that when he crashed, he crashed hard and was out until, sometime for the race to start. Apparently, meth bonds folks, and they put them to, on the same frequency because Troy, who still hadn't slept since Friday night, had no problem. That he said he understood perfectly. Apparently, he'd been there and done that and was expecting to rinse and repeat pretty soon. So after he hit a few bumps of the trailer park rocket fuel, they spin the meth head wheel of fortune. Now, I say that because there has to be something like that going on in the meth head mind because they're always coming up with something out of the wild blue yonder to get in the middle of. This time, the wheel landed on Troy, Shane, and Stacy, climbing into Shane's big Dodge truck and going four-wheeling. They hadn't a bit more got that idea. Then they remembered Troy still ain't been deer hunting, so they grabbed enough weapons to held off the Mexican army at the Alamo and take them with them. Of course, it goes without saying that they grabbed up all the meth and beer that they could carry and to take with them. Now, meth heads with alcohol in an arsenal, what could go wrong now? Well, they hit the road on the way to the woods. They had to drive by mutual friends of all three of them's house on the way. Troy might not have been hanging out with the Walters boys, but a little over 48 hours at this point, but they all three knew a woman by the name of Tammy Steele. It was at her house that they were fixing to pass when somebody spun that meth head wheel of fortune again, and they decided to drop in and see what Tammy was up to. Of course, that turned into another bump stop where they all put some more of that marching powder up the nose. And while that was going on, Troy's wife, Michelle, remember her, she started burning up Troy's cell phone and just burning it plumb up. Probably wondering exactly where in the blue blazes he was and why the septic tank was dug up and dragged all over the bar's backyard and why it wasn't fixed. At this point, if Troy was to go home, I'd say that he'd have to knock on the door and ask Michelle why she didn't pay the ransom. He'd been gone so long. It sounded like she didn't even know he'd been home at all because he hadn't been in bed and slept since Friday night. Once Michelle spit Troy's rear end out and hung up the phone, he announced to his posse that he reckoned he wouldn't be going home tonight either. So they're all parked there at Tammy's house, apparently forgetting where they were going in the first place, chicken flipping the meth. And Troy figured that, well, he got him some real good friends in these Walters boys that he'd been hanging around since Friday night. Yeah, among other things and other great advantages of meth, it has a way of speeding up the process of building great friendships and nothing flat too. So, being that the Walters boys were now his closest lifelong bothersome buddies and pals, Troy, well, he started telling them about his money problems and that the bar was pretty much going down the sewer, which was backed up. So now it might just be me. I'd say that if he'd concentrate a little bit more on selling drinks instead of giving them away at a bonfire in the back, the bar might just be a little better off. Now, it was right in the middle of this sermon on how to screw up a life that Tammy's sister Danielle showed up and jumped in because the water was just fine. That was about the time that Paul Zastro unknowingly spun the meth head wheel of fortune one more time for the meth heads. This time, he called while they were tweaking and skittling it up there at Tammy's. He wanted to know if Troy could run by traditions and bring him some beer. Now, I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with the blue laws and what they are, but selling alcohol on Sunday was illegal in a blue law county. And all the blue law counties across this country, and Townville was one of them, and that meant that only a bar or the only beer hookup that Paul had was a Troy, and apparently he didn't mind handing it out for free, which would be pushing the law, but wouldn't technically be illegal. Maybe Paul, might slip him a little gas money for the trip, not the beer, you know what I mean. I'm not sure, but Troy even thought that far ahead at that point, to be honest with you. So Troy, after bitching about the bar going down the toilet, along with Shane and Danielle, pile into the big Dodge Ram and head over to Traditions on a beer run. Troy runs into the bar because walking while tweaking ain't an option. He grabs a case or so of beer and they head over to Paul to deliver. Of course, while they're there, they throw back a few of the bar's profits with Paul. Then they break out the nose candy and go to town like they won't be making the stuff anymore. Note here, most of the time, if somebody has this much of the stuff, they're what's known as a cook. That means they're making it. So somebody in the triad of new friends is probably a cook. It's a wonder these people have any heart valves left that ain't sprung into congestive heart failure at this point, folks. Well, the three of them, once they ran out of the to-go meth that they took with them, they went back to Tammy's house where Stacy and Tammy had been hitting the dancing dust and beer pretty hard too. Once everybody got inside, Stacy and Tammy figured that they would be a good idea if they would make an announcement that while everybody was gone on a beer delivery, they'd had intimate relations, because everybody really needed to know that, I reckon. Apparently, everybody got a real good laugh out of that one, but the comedy didn't stop there. They had to fill them in on the details. They told everybody that they were using a condom, which must have broke because they lost it. Now, by then, everybody was rolling on the floor howling with laughter. Yes, folks, another advantage of meth is that it enhances one's sense of humor to the point where just about anything's funny. Once they all recovered from that, they lit right back into the drinking and snorting up until about 5 o'clock the next morning. That's when somebody pointed out that according to the meth head wheel of fortune, we were supposed to go four-wheeling about 13 hours ago. So Shane, Stacy, and Troy, well, they pile back up in the truck and take off again. So, like every good meth head, of course, they got about 10 feet down the road before somebody spins the wheel again. This time, they wind up at another person's house named Sonia Can. Sonia wasn't really a close friend of any of them, but they all knew her because she was a waitress that worked in a few establishments around the area. So, I reckon when they came to calling about 5 o'clock in the morning, they probably ripped her up out of a good sleep. And once they all got inside, they commenced to hit the crystal all over again. They all spent about 30 minutes or so loading up their noses before deciding to hit the road again. This time, Sonia joined them in the truck. She sat up front between Shane and Troy, with Stacy in the back seat. Now, they drove around for a spell before pulling into a kudzu field that overlooked Lake Hartwell. Now, I reckon it to hit the marching powder and maybe spin the wheel of fortune again. Now, at around 8 o'clock in the morning, Chief Lee of the Seneca, South Carolina Police Department had a bit more and got to work, grabbed some of that high-octane coffee that we hear so much about, and had a seat at his desk when Warren Burkhart, who you remember is Troy's father, walked into the police department and asked to speak to Chief Lee. Now, Warren, with him being a retired police officer and all, was real good friends with Chief Lee and had been for a good many years. Warren tells Chief that his son Troy done killed some folks over across the county line in Anderson. To say that Chief was shocked would be an understatement. He was even more shocked when Warren said that he really didn't know much about the details, but he had Troy out in the truck and he could explain it all to him. So Warren goes out and brings Troy in, First thing that caught the chief's eye was that Troy looked like he'd been in a squirt gun battle with blood-filled super soakers, and his wife Michelle was standing there in shock beside him. Now, the man was completely covered in blood spatter. Troy explained to Chief Lee that he had killed 3 people over by Lake Hartwell, but it was self-defense. Now, he told the chief that they were Shane Walters, Stacy Walters, and Sonia Can. Troy said that he wanted to take the police to the scene of the crime. Now, I mean self-defense killings. Of course, the kudzu field was in Anderson County, but the chief said that he would notify them and run over with Troy. Once the investigators got there, it was more than apparent that all 3 were definitely dead and had most certainly been made that way by somebody from inside the truck, which they actually found over at Warren Burkhart's place. And then once they were shot, they were dragged out of it, and the inside of the truck was a bloodbath riddled with 11 bullet holes. It was also apparent that the investigators that once Shane and Stacy were dragged out of the truck, they were kicked and beat and stomped once they were slung on the ground. Sonia, well, she wasn't kicked and beat or stomped or anything, but was shot again an extra time in the head once she had been pulled out of the truck and dropped on the ground. In total, Shane Walters was shot 6 times, once directly in the back of the head. Stacy was shot twice, once in the right temple and once in the right cheek. And Sonia he was shot twice, once in the right temple and once in the left eye. Now, police also found 2 empty clips at the scene. That means that Troy shot everybody, reloaded, and kept blasting. What you see there is a picture of Sonia. That is the only victim picture that I could find. But at that point, I'm sure that handcuffs made an appearance along with a swift trip downtown where somebody had a few questions for Troy. So he was dragged into the hot box and shoved in a chair. He drew in a big breath and explained it all. He said once they pulled into the field, the atmosphere in the truck got really dark. He said that they opened a few beers and everybody was drinking. And at that point, Sonia pulled out some meth and said so said the meth head, as if he didn't already have a mother load of the stuff without her pulling out some more. But he continued on saying that she gave the meth to Stacy, and Stacy went stretching out some of them little white caterpillars on a CD case, kind of like what you see there in that picture. Now, no, they didn't specify it as a Skinner CD, though I wouldn't discount it, being that the original band played their last show there right up the road there in Greenville just a few hours before their original plane crash and some of the original members were killed. But Troy kept explaining. He said that he asked Shane where the deer were. Shane didn't say anything. Sonia said that there ain't no deer here. This is a scattering field. Now, to us Appalachians, we know that a scattering field is a place where you see a kind of a transition from a ridge or maybe a bank into a big open space. Now, scattering fields usually have some kind of a unique rock cave or maybe water sinkhole type formation that gets your attention. Now, I always thought that they called them scattering fields because of the way that the hunting dogs scatter across the field when folks are bird hunting, because it's a prime place for bird hunting. But that's just my opinion. Now, that might explain the reason that the kudzu was planted there in the first place. Now, I remember when they first used that stuff to cover rocky or dirt embankments before they figured out that it was the Frankenstein monster of the plant world. So the big talking heads thought that it was a cotton-picking rage of the age. It was a hardy plant that grows fast and has good, strong root structure for support. It would keep embankments from washing out and grow over to hide ugly places, making them more pleasant to look at. Somebody along the way forgot to tell the kudzu that it wasn't supposed to keep growing like bamboo in Southeast Asia until it choked the life out of every tree, plant, and structure that it could reach until folks had to burn it off. Now, folks, they burn it off because Roundup or any other weed killer, the kudzu is like pouring some nice cool spring water on it. It don't even faze it. At least I haven't seen it in my few laps around the sun in the times I've used it to try to kill it. So, back to Troy, who's sitting there talking like an auctioneer on meth because he was actually on meth. Now, he said that the conversation in the truck turned to the money problems that he was talking about earlier. Shane piped up and tells Troy that he knew a feller that wasn't associated with any bank or anything that could loan Troy a little money. That's when Stacy passed the CD case over to Troy with 4 lines of meth on it. Troy thought that was odd because it already had been through everybody in the truck, and everybody had been using the stuff like a bunch of Hoover vacuum cleaners before then, but nobody had done a single line of meth. Here's another advantage of meth, folks. It enhances your keen sense of being able to spot something suspicious. In fact, it enhances it to the point to where you're suspicious of everything and everybody, to the point of where you're completely paranoid that a light bulb might actually be a camera that's watching. So, he's wondering why everybody was wanting him to do the honors of the first line of meth. Troy said that that's about the time that Shane turned around and asked him if he ever wronged anybody. Of course, Troy, now doing the full tilt meth boogie, asked Shane what he meant by that. And Shane said that, have you ever wronged your Uncle Ronnie? Troy told police that that's when things got weird. Yeah, folks, that's when the weirdness busted through the front door, took a seat at the head of the table, and demanded to be recognized. Goodness knows nothing else has been weird so far, has it? Troy said that the question about his Uncle Ronnie struck fear plumb into his soul. Ronnie Burkhart was Troy's father, Warren's brother. He was a well-known drug dealer who hated Warren. He didn't just hate Warren, but he hated Troy too. Not just because Warren was a cop and he was a drug dealer, but because he and Warren had several land disputes, actually led to a big slobber knocker right there in the court hearing over said land dispute. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I'd gladly pay a ticket fee to see 2 geezers duking it out in court. But Troy told him that Shane then said that he had this thing worked out with Ronnie, and Ronnie had a lot of money from his drug deals down in Florida, and that Ronnie promised him that, if he took care of Troy, he could have a whole lot of money. So, apparently Shane had been playing the long, drawn-out version of a hit on Troy, according to Troy, that is. Makes about as much sense as going hunting and announcing to the animal that you're hunting that you're fixing to shoot him. Now, that being said, we also got to remember that we're dealing with a gaggle of meth heads, clearly in possession of a meth head wheel of fortune, so about anything we could come up with would probably pale in comparison to what probably actually happened in the truck. Now, regardless of all of that, as far as the investigators were concerned, it ain't looking good for Troy, who kept right on piling it on thicker and heavier as he went. Now, he said at that point, Shane forced him out of the truck at gunpoint, and Stacy put a knife to his neck, and then said that Walter's boys told him that they were going to make him squeal like a pig. Boy, it sounds like he's been watching too many movies, don't it? And don't forget Sonia. He had to drag her into it by telling them that she said, yeah, baby, make him squeal like a pig. He said that he snatched the gun away from Shane and commenced to blast it. He just said he shot in the direction of everybody until he couldn't shoot no more, and then he pulled Shane and Sonia out of the truck, and that's when he saw extra clips and reloaded and let them have round 2 just to make sure they wasn't going to get up and keep coming after him. Then he leaped in Shane's truck and ripped off out of there because he was afraid that there just might be somebody else, maybe even his Uncle Ronnie, out there ready to pick up where they left off. Next thing he thought, what with Uncle Ronnie being the Don Corleone of Townville and all, was that his wife and father might be in danger too. So he hauled it over in the Swiss cheesed up truck to his dad's house, who was probably having his first cup of Monday morning coffee. I can only imagine being in the middle of laying out my week because I'm in construction and own my own restaurant, only to look up and see my meth head son rolling up in a shot up, blood coated truck first thing on Monday morning. That's when Troy convinced his dad that Uncle Ronnie was on the warpath and they got to go get Michelle. So they jump in Warren's truck and head over to pick her up, and that's how they wound up at Chief Lee's office right in the middle of his first cup of coffee on Monday morning. Now, you already know how many times who was shot, and there was one odd thing found during the autopsy. Now, while the coroner was working on Stacy Walters' body, he found that Stacy was wearing a condom under his clothes when all the shooting went down. Now, like we've already observed, there ain't no telling for sure why in the world that might be, but we do remember that he did have relations with Tammy Steele and apparently lost one. Maybe he was so jacked up that he couldn't focus his eyes and see that he never lost it to start with. By that time, Troy was done talking with police. They were impressed with his imagination, but didn't believe a bit of what he said. So he was officially arrested, charged with 3 counts of capital murder, and put on trial for his life, being that the prosecutor wanted to kill him back for what he did. Now, on March 6, 2000, the trial fired up. The prosecutor said that based on the forensic evidence, Troy's story of shooting him in self-defense was impossible, especially since Troy had stomped the dead bodies of the Walters boys once they were all shot up and laying on the ground. The defense attorneys, well, they said that Troy did have a valid self-defense case, like they're supposed to do. And the prosecution pointed out that Troy took the opportunity to reload once the 3 people were down, instead of making a run for it if he was so worried about them going to kill him. Of course, the defense stuck with the squeal like a pig defense, saying that Uncle Ronnie was behind it all. Police did confirm that Ronnie Burkhart had been a target of a federal drug investigation. At that point, Ronnie actually was suffering from cancer and would end up dying in April of 2000, just less than a month after Troy's trial. Now, the defense said that Troy's knowledge of his Uncle Ronnie's cartel put him on his uncle's to-do list. Now, when the jury went in to sort everything out, they deliberated for 4 hours that night and then for 1 hour the next morning before returning a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of murder and possession of a firearm during a violent crime. At that point, Troy Burkhart was sentenced to death. So I guess that's it, right? No, it ain't. Come 2002, Troy was sitting on death row staring through the bars at the cement wall. And I do believe, death row don't come with a view or anything, I guess, but the death chamber or the wall. And I imagine he didn't care to look in that direction. And that's when these attorneys filed an appeal on his behalf, and the appeal court overturned the whole thing and gave him a whole new trial. Apparently, they wasn't in a hurry this time and scheduled it for March of 2004, and it was pretty much a replay of the first one, and he was found guilty on all counts all over again and resentenced to his appointment with the executioner. So, after the judge told him to get him out of his face-off, he went back to the cell and was promptly locked away right in the same place. Now, if you're thinking we're done, you'd be just like me, mistaken. Along about 2007, another appeal was filed. This time in July of 2007, Troy got a resentencing hearing instead of a whole new trial. At that point, it had been 10 years since the crime, and the families and the victims were all fed up with hearing the name Troy Burkhart, so they agreed to just be done with him by letting the court sentence him to life without parole. Now, you can say we're done with him, unless there's some kind of new evidence that comes out of left field. Today, he sits in Kirkland Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. He still maintains his innocence, and to beat it all, his poor wife Michelle believes him. The heck of it all is that Troy, being all methed up in his perception being all methed up, he probably actually believes that he was attacked and had no alternative but to shoot in self-defense. And folks, that's just methed up. I hope you got something out of our story today. If you did, please rate and review the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube or Rumble, throw us a like and don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you're watch or listen. Now, come on over to Appalachian Murder Mystery